There are stories that feel, from the moment they surface, like they are larger than they appear. Stories where the edges don't quite meet, where the official explanation sits beside the documented facts, and the two things don't fully line up, no matter how carefully you arrange them. Where the people who should be asking the loudest questions seem, instead, to go very quiet. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is one of those stories. It is not, at its core, a story about a single man. It never really was, from the moment his name first appeared in legal documents, in courtroom testimony, in the private communications of some of the most powerful people on earth. It was clear that Jeffrey Epstein was a door, and that behind that door was something that a great many influential people very much did not want opened. In the next 2 hours, we are going to walk through all of it. We'll start with the documented history. Who Jeffrey Epstein was, where he came from, how he built the life he built, and what the official record says happened to him. We'll look at the first criminal case, the deal that ended it, and the questions that deal left behind. Then we'll move into the theories, the ones about intelligence agencies, about blackmail networks, about the island, about the names in the flight logs, about what really happened in a jail cell in Lower Manhattan in August of 2019. And then we'll go deeper, into the stranger and less charted territory, the connections to scientific research, to transhumanist ideology, to a network of relationships that seems, the closer you look at it, to connect nearly every significant center of power in the Western world. You don't need to watch the screen tonight. Just settle in, let the words move past you, and follow the story at whatever distance feels comfortable. Some of what you're about to hear is documented fact, confirmed by court records, by investigative journalism, by the testimony of survivors who told their stories at considerable personal cost. Some of it is theory, informed speculation built on patterns that may mean something or may mean nothing, depending on where you stand. We won't be prosecuting anyone tonight. That is not what this is for. This is for the quiet hours, for the part of the mind that notices the things that don't fit, that holds the unresolved questions without needing to force them into answers. The Epstein story is, in many ways, still unfinished. The full picture has not emerged, and perhaps it never will. But what has emerged is enough to sit with, enough to think about, enough to remind us that power, in its most concentrated forms, operates by rules that most of us never see. Let's start at the beginning. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His background was unremarkable by the standards of the world he would eventually inhabit. His father, Seymour Epstein, worked for the New York City Parks Department, a modest, steady job in the tradition of mid-century municipal employment. His mother, Pauline, was a homemaker and later a school aide. The family lived in Coney Island in the Seagate neighborhood, a gated community, unusually enough, though one of a working class rather than a wealthy character. Brick buildings, narrow streets, the smell of salt water not far off. There was no inherited wealth. There were no famous family connections. There were no introductions waiting, no doors already open. There was, by most accounts, an unusually sharp and restless mind. Epstein was gifted mathematically from an early age. His aptitude for numbers was noticed by teachers and acknowledged by classmates. He moved through the New York City public school system quickly, graduating from Lafayette High School at 16, 2 years ahead of his peers. The early graduation is a small detail, but it is worth noting. It was the first of many moments in Epstein's life when the normal pace of things seemed to apply to him differently than to everyone around him. He enrolled at the Cooper Union in Manhattan, one of the few fully tuition-free colleges in the United States, with a historically rigorous program in engineering, art, and architecture. He studied mathematics and physics. He then transferred to New York University. Continuing in the same subjects, he was, by the accounts of those who knew him in this period, intensely curious, drawn not just to the mechanics of mathematics, but to the philosophical dimensions of it, to the ways that abstract patterns described the behavior of money, of systems, of human decisions. He did not finish his degree. The reasons for his departure from NYU have never been precisely documented. What is documented is what came next. And it represents one of the first of many moments in the Epstein story where the normal rules of credentialing and institutional gatekeeping seem simply not to have applied. In 1974, at the age of 20, Jeffrey Epstein was hired as a mathematics and physics teacher at the Dalton School. The Dalton School is, and was in 1974, one of the most prestigious private preparatory schools in New York City, and by extension, in the country. Its students are the children of old money and new money, of prominent lawyers and bankers, and artists and politicians. Its faculty are typically credentialed professionals with advanced degrees and established academic records. Epstein had none of these things. He was a 20-year-old college dropout applying for a position at one of the most selective institutions in the city. How he got the job is a question that has never been fully answered. The most commonly cited explanation involves a combination of factors. His evident mathematical ability, which he could demonstrate directly in an interview setting without need of a diploma, his manner, which multiple people who knew him in this period described as magnetic and unusually self-possessed for his age, and what appears to have been, even then, a talent for finding the right person to impress and making exactly the impression that was needed. He taught at Dalton for 2 years. By most accounts, he was an effective teacher. His students remembered him as engaging, intellectually stimulating, demanding in ways that felt motivating rather than punitive. But the teaching was not, in retrospect, the point of those 2 years. The point was the connections. It was at Dalton that Epstein entered, for the first time, the social world of New York's upper class. Not as a member of it, but as an observer, a presence, a person who knew the children of its most significant figures, and was therefore known to those figures in return. Among the parents of his students was Alan Greenberg, known professionally as Ace Greenberg, the chairman of the investment bank Bear Stearns, one of the most prominent financial institutions in the country. Greenberg was impressed by the young teacher. Whether their relationship developed through formal introduction or through the informal social proximity of school events and parent-teacher meetings is not entirely clear. What is clear is that in 1976, Epstein left Dalton and joined Bear Stearns as a low-level assistant. He was 23 years old. He had no financial credentials, no degree, and no prior experience in banking. What followed over the next several years was a rise that colleagues at Bear Stearns would later describe in terms ranging from admiring to unnerving. Epstein absorbed the culture of the firm with extraordinary speed. He became an options trader, a role that suited his mathematical instincts and his appetite for complexity. He advanced to limited partner. He was, by the early 1980s, working on matters involving some of the firm's most significant clients. People who worked alongside him during this period described a man of remarkable intelligence and focus, someone who understood both the technical architecture of financial instruments and the human dynamics of the relationships those instruments were embedded in. He was also, by multiple accounts, someone who operated with a flexibility around rules that made some colleagues uncomfortable even then. In 1981, Epstein was asked to leave Bear Stearns. The specific circumstances have never been fully disclosed. Regulatively violations are the most commonly cited reason. Some reporting suggests issues related to sharing non-public information. Whatever the precise nature of the departure, it was handled quietly. There was no public scandal, no legal proceeding, no mark on any visible record that followed him out the door. He was 28 years old. He had spent 5 years at one of the country's most prominent investment banks, risen further and faster than almost anyone without formal credentials had any right to expect, and had left under circumstances that were never explained to the public. And then, with no visible hesitation, no apparent period of recalibration, he simply began the next chapter. After leaving Bear Stearns, Epstein founded his own financial management firm, which he called J. Epstein and Company. He told people it catered exclusively to clients with a net worth of $1 billion or more. He claimed at various times to manage the finances of dozens of such clients. He described himself as a kind of financial troubleshooter for the ultra-wealthy, someone who handled not just investment management, but the complex, sensitive problems that accompany the ownership of very large sums of money. The offices were in Manhattan. The address was impressive. The presentation was impeccable. And yet, when investigators and journalists later attempted to document the actual business, the clients, the filings, the regulatory records that any legitimate financial management operation of that scale would necessarily generate, they found essentially nothing. No verified client list has ever been made public. No regulatory filings consistent with managing multiple billions of dollars in assets have ever been produced. Financial journalists who spent years investigating Epstein's claimed business found a paper architecture that seemed on close examination to be largely facade, the appearance of a financial empire without the visible substance. This is the central, still unresolved mystery at the core of everything that follows. No one has ever satisfactorily explained where Jeffrey Epstein's money came from. The scale of his lifestyle was not modest. The Manhattan townhouse he eventually acquired, 9 East 71st Street on the Upper East Side, was, by the time he purchased it, reportedly the largest private residence in New York City, a 40-room mansion spread across multiple floors, purchased for less than $10 million in the early 1990s from the Wexner family, and subsequently renovated at a cost that some estimates placed in the tens of millions. He also owned a ranch in Stanley, New Mexico, spanning approximately 10,000 acres, a private island in the United States Virgin Islands. Little St. James, purchased in 1998 for approximately $7.95 million. A Paris apartment on the Avenue Foch, one of the most exclusive addresses in that city, and a fleet of aircraft that included a Boeing 727, a Gulfstream, and a helicopter. The maintenance costs of this infrastructure alone, the staff, the upkeep, the running of properties across multiple continents and jurisdictions, would have required a very large and very consistent income. Where it came from remains, in any public and official accounting, unanswered. The closest thing to an explanation involves one name above all others. Leslie Wexner is the founder and for many decades the chairman of the L Brands retail empire, whose holdings included Victoria's Secret, Limited, Bath & Body Works, and other significant consumer brands. He is one of the wealthiest men in Ohio, and, for many years, one of the wealthiest men in the United States. Beginning around 1987, Wexner extended to Epstein a degree of financial trust that struck virtually everyone who became aware of it as extraordinary. He gave Epstein power of attorney over his personal estate, a legal instrument that granted Epstein the authority to act on Wexner's behalf in financial and legal matters. He gave Epstein access to his accounts. He transferred the Manhattan townhouse to Epstein for a sum below market value in circumstances that have never been fully explained. He appeared, by multiple accounts, to regard Epstein as a kind of financial genius, someone whose judgment he trusted above his own in matters of money. The relationship lasted approximately a decade before apparently souring. Wexner has since said that he was defrauded by Epstein, that Epstein misappropriated funds from him, possibly in the range of tens of millions of dollars. He has characterized himself as a victim of Epstein's manipulation, a man who trusted the wrong person with too much access. This account is plausible. Sophisticated people are defrauded by trusted associates. It happens. And yet, the relationship, examined closely, raises questions that the fraud narrative doesn't fully resolve. Wexner is not a naive man. He built a multi-billion-dollar retail empire from a single store in Columbus, Ohio. He is, by every professional assessment, an unusually shrewd and careful businessman. The idea that he extended and maintained for roughly a decade essentially unconditional financial authority to someone who was, in his account, systematically stealing from him without noticing, without auditing, without the mechanisms of oversight that one would expect a man of his sophistication to maintain, is something that serious investigators have found difficult to accept at face value. The Wexner connection remains. To those who have studied it most closely, one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire Epstein biography. By the 1990s, Epstein had become a fixture in a social world that occupied a very specific stratum of American life, above the merely wealthy, below the level of publicly elected office, in the particular space where old money and new money and academic prestige and political access blurred into each other at private dinners and island retreats, and the kind of gatherings where the guest list is never published and the conversation is never recorded. He was known, and was known by an extraordinary range of significant people. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, second son of Queen Elizabeth II, former President Bill Clinton, whose foundation received donations connected to Epstein's network, and who flew on Epstein's private aircraft on multiple documented occasions. Donald Trump, who at the time was a prominent New York real estate figure, and who later, as a presidential candidate and president, would work to distance himself from any association. Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard law professor, who was among the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in the country, and who would later become a central figure in the legal proceedings surrounding Epstein's victims. Stephen Hawking, the theoretical physicist. Noam Chomsky, the linguist and political philosopher. Lawrence Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton and former president of Harvard University. George Mitchell, the former Senate Majority Leader and Northern Ireland peace negotiator. Leon Black, the billionaire founder of Apollo Global Management. Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister of Israel. An assortment of technology executives, hedge fund managers, biologists, neuroscientists, and socialites whose names collectively fill hundreds of pages of court documents. The breadth of this network is, on its own, one of the most remarkable features of the Epstein story. Very few people in modern American life, outside of heads of state and the most prominent philanthropists, have moved across as many different worlds with as much apparent ease. Scientists and politicians, royalty and rock stars, people of the highest public reputation, and people who preferred to operate entirely in private. How he cultivated and maintained this network is something we will examine more closely in the sections that follow. His primary social partner, and according to federal prosecutors, his primary recruiter of victims, was Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell was the youngest daughter of Robert Maxwell, a British media tycoon, who at the height of his power owned newspapers and publishing houses across multiple countries and wielded influence in British public life that was, by most assessments, disproportionate to what his legitimate business interests would have warranted. Robert Maxwell died in November of 1991, under circumstances that have never been fully resolved. He was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named, as it happened, for his youngest daughter. Spanish authorities ruled the death accidental, likely a fall from the boat, but subsequent investigations found that the circumstances were consistent with several other possibilities, and the case was never definitively closed to everyone's satisfaction. What emerged after his death was the revelation that the Maxwell business empire had been built on a structure of debt and financial manipulation that was, in essence, a fraud. Pension funds had been looted. Creditors had been deceived. The empire collapsed almost immediately after Robert Maxwell's death, leaving employees without their pensions and a family suddenly stripped of the wealth and status they had grown up with. Ghislaine Maxwell, who had been among her father's favorites and had occupied a privileged position at the center of his social world, arrived in New York in the years after his death and appears to have been introduced to Jeffrey Epstein through overlapping social circles. The precise nature and origin of their relationship has been the subject of considerable investigation and considerable contradiction in the testimony of those who knew them. What is clear is that they became, for at least a decade, inseparable in the social sense, and, according to the prosecution in Maxwell's eventual criminal trial, deeply and criminally entangled in the operational sense. Maxwell provided something Epstein needed but could not supply himself: social legitimacy. She was the daughter of a famous man, a British socialite with connections to royalty and established European society. Her presence at Epstein's side smoothed his entry into circles that might otherwise have looked more carefully at his background. She vouched implicitly for his worthiness of trust. In return, she received from Epstein the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to under her father's wealth: the houses, the travel, the social position. The abuse that Epstein conducted had been happening, survivors testified, since at least the mid-1990s. Young women, many of them teenagers, some as young as 14, were recruited, often under the pretense of legitimate employment: massage work that paid well, modeling introductions, educational mentorship, connections to opportunities that would be transformative for a young person without resources. They were brought to Epstein's various properties: the Manhattan townhouse, the Palm Beach mansion, the New Mexico ranch, the island. There they were subjected to sexual abuse. Many were then pressured, through a combination of financial inducement and psychological manipulation, to recruit others. The pattern was consistent. The scale was significant. The documentation, by the time investigators began to assemble it, was substantial, and it had been going on for years before any legal process began. The first serious legal investigation commenced in Palm Beach, Florida, in 2005, when the parents of a 14-year-old girl reported her abuse to local police. The Palm Beach Police Department conducted a careful investigation. They identified multiple victims. They executed search warrants. They documented a pattern of conduct that pointed clearly and specifically to a significant and ongoing criminal enterprise. Their recommendation to prosecutors was for serious federal charges. What happened next is what transformed the Epstein case from a criminal matter into something that has occupied investigators, journalists, legal scholars, and the public imagination for the better part of 2 decades. The case was effectively removed from the hands of local prosecutors and assumed by the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, at the time a man named Alexander Acosta, a Harvard Law graduate who had been appointed to his position by President George W. Bush. In 2008, after extended negotiations that were conducted in secret and without the knowledge of the identified victims, a fact that courts would later find to be a violation of federal law. Acosta's office finalized a non-prosecution agreement with Epstein's legal team. The agreement was, in the assessment of every legal scholar who has examined it, profoundly and unusually favorable to Epstein. Under its terms, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state charges in Florida: 1 count of procuring a person under 18 for prostitution, and 1 count of soliciting prostitution. The characterization of his victims as prostitutes, rather than as victims of trafficking, was itself deeply controversial, and was experienced by survivors as a profound secondary violation. He was sentenced to 18 months in a Palm Beach County jail. He was permitted to leave the jail on work release 6 days a week for up to 12 hours a day to work from his Palm Beach office. an arrangement so unusual that it drew the attention of the Justice Department Inspector General, who later found it was not consistent with standard work release practices. He served 13 months. The federal charges that Acosta's office had the authority to bring, charges that could have put Epstein in federal prison for the remainder of his life, were dropped entirely and permanently. The agreement included a grant of immunity not only to Epstein himself, but to unnamed co-conspirators, a provision of extraordinary breadth that effectively shielded anyone else who might have been involved from federal prosecution. The victims were not informed of the agreement before it was signed. They were not consulted. They were not given the opportunity, as federal law required, to be heard before the agreement was finalized. Subsequent courts found this to be a clear violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, a finding that came too late to undo what had already been done. When Acosta was asked, years later, to explain his decisions, he offered several justifications: that the case had been difficult to prosecute, that Epstein's legal team had been formidable, that the alternative to the agreement might have been no conviction at all. He also said something else, something that has reverberated through the entire subsequent history of this story. He said he had been told by figures above him that Epstein belonged to intelligence, and that he should handle the matter carefully. He did not name those figures. He did not identify which intelligence service. He has never, in any public forum, elaborated on what he meant, who told him, or what the specific communication was. He resigned from his position as Secretary of Labor in July of 2019, when investigative reporting by journalist Julie K. Brown in the Miami Herald brought the details of the non-prosecution agreement back into public view. Epstein was released in 2010. He resumed his social life. He traveled. He continued to receive visitors. He attended conferences and hosted dinners. The consequences of his conviction, in practical terms, were modest in ways that continued to astonish the survivors who had been waiting for justice. He was arrested again on July 6, 2019, at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, as he stepped off his private jet returning from Paris. This time, the charges came from the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, a different office with different prosecutors, and a different appetite for the case. The indictment charged him with 1 count of sex trafficking of minors and 1 count of conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The alleged conduct described in the indictment spanned from approximately 2002 to 2005, a narrow window, prosecutors acknowledged, but one for which they had strong evidence. Bail was denied. Epstein was remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan to await trial. On the morning of August 10, 2019, 36 days after his arrest, Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell. He was transported to New York Presbyterian Lower Manhattan Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner ruled the death a suicide by hanging. The guards assigned to check on him had been asleep. The cameras covering his area of the facility had malfunctioned. The trial that would have required the disclosure of an enormous amount of information about an enormous number of powerful people would not take place. And the questions began. He didn't kill himself. No theory about Jeffrey Epstein is more widely known or more persistently stated than this one. The claim is simple. Jeffrey Epstein did not take his own life. He was killed. Murdered by agents acting on behalf of one or more of the powerful people whose names appeared in his client list, his flight logs, and the sealed documents of his legal proceedings. This theory is held not only by people on the fringes of public discourse. Polls conducted shortly after his death found that a significant plurality of Americans, in some surveys a majority, did not believe the official suicide ruling. Medical examiners publicly disagreed with the official finding. Legal experts questioned the institutional failures that surrounded it. Attorneys for Epstein's estate commissioned an independent forensic examination, and the phrase "Epstein didn't kill himself" became, in the months and years after his death, one of the most widely repeated sentences on the internet, appearing on bumper stickers, in comment sections, in the margins of conversations about entirely unrelated subjects, as a kind of shorthand for a broader distrust of official explanations. To understand why, it helps to walk through the circumstances of his death carefully and slowly. Epstein entered the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan on July 6, 2019, following his arrest at Teterboro Airport. The MCC, as it is commonly known, is a federal detention facility operated by the Bureau of Prisons. It sits in the Civic Center neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, a gray and largely unremarkable building that has housed over the years some of the most significant federal defendants in American legal history, including, at various points, members of organized crime families and high-profile terrorism defendants. By the time Epstein arrived, the MCC was a facility under significant strain. It was chronically understaffed. Guards were frequently required to work overtime shifts that exceeded the limits recommended by the Bureau of Prisons' own guidelines. Equipment was aging. The institutional culture, by the accounts of people familiar with it, was one of exhaustion and minimal compliance rather than rigorous security. These conditions matter. They form the context in which everything that followed occurred. On the night of July 23rd, roughly 2.5 weeks after his arrival, Epstein was found in his cell in a condition that was described by prison staff as an apparent suicide attempt. He had marks on his neck. He told investigators he had been assaulted by his cellmate, a former police officer and accused murderer named Nicholas Tartaglione, who was awaiting trial on drug-related murder charges. Tartaglione has consistently denied any involvement. Whether the July incident was an assault or a suicide attempt was never definitively determined. The ambiguity is itself notable. The two explanations have very different implications, and neither was pursued to a clear resolution before the next final event. Following the July incident, Epstein was placed on suicide watch, a protocol requiring close monitoring, removal of items that could be used for self-harm, and frequent checks by staff. Approximately a week later, he was removed from suicide watch. This decision was made by a prison psychologist and approved by prison administrators. The reasoning behind it has never been fully explained in any public document. Epstein was returned to the special housing unit, a more isolated area of the facility, and assigned a cellmate. That cellmate was transferred out of the cell on or around August 9th. Epstein spent the final night of his life alone. On the night of August 9th into the early morning of August 10th, the two corrections officers assigned to check on Epstein at 30-minute intervals, as required by Bureau of Prisons protocol for inmates in the special housing unit. Both fell asleep. This is not disputed. It was confirmed by the Justice Department's own investigation. The two officers, Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, were later criminally charged with falsifying prison records, specifically with filling out logs indicating they had conducted the required checks when they had not. The charges were eventually dropped when both officers agreed to complete community service and participate in a counseling program. They faced no further legal consequence. The security cameras covering Epstein's cell area malfunctioned that night. This too is documented. Two cameras positioned to capture footage of the area outside Epstein's cell produced footage that was later found to be unusable. One camera had a technical malfunction, and footage from the area was either corrupted or, in one account, accidentally recorded. Over. Exactly which cameras captured what, and why the footage was unavailable, was never resolved in any public proceeding. Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell by prison staff in the early morning of August 10th. He was transported to New York Presbyterian Lower Manhattan Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, conducted the official autopsy and ruled the death a suicide by hanging, concluding that the manner of death was consistent with self-inflicted ligature strangulation. Dr. Michael Baden, one of the most experienced forensic pathologists in the United States, a former New York City chief medical examiner himself, with decades of experience investigating high-profile deaths, was commissioned by Epstein's estate to conduct an independent review. He was present during the official autopsy as an observer. Dr. Baden reached different conclusions. He noted publicly and specifically that the injuries observed on Epstein's body included fractures to several bones in the neck, including the hyoid bone and fractures of the thyroid cartilage. He stated that this pattern of injury was more consistent in his professional assessment with homicidal strangulation than with suicide by hanging. He noted that broken hyoid bones occur in a minority of hanging deaths, more commonly in older individuals, which Epstein was, but that the combination of injuries present was, in his view, unusual enough to warrant a ruling of undetermined rather than suicide. Dr. Sampson and the official medical examiner's office disputed Dr. Baden's interpretation. They maintained that the evidence was consistent with hanging and that the ruling of suicide was appropriate. The disagreement between these two experienced, credentialed forensic professionals has never been resolved. No subsequent independent official review was commissioned. The ruling stands. There are additional details that theorists and investigators have noted. Epstein's body reportedly showed signs of hemorrhaging in his eyes. Petechiae, the small burst blood vessels that can occur in both hanging and strangulation. The bedsheet, or material used in the alleged hanging, was not photographed in a way that was made available to independent reviewers. The full autopsy report was not released publicly for some time, and when it was disputed by Dr. Baden almost immediately. There is also the matter of what Epstein reportedly told people in the days before his death, according to reporting by several news organizations. Epstein had expressed to associates and legal team members that he did not intend to kill himself, that he was planning to cooperate with prosecutors, that he believed he would eventually be released, that he had things he wanted to say. Whether these reports reflect his genuine state of mind or were themselves strategic communications is impossible to verify. What can be said is this: the circumstances of Jeffrey Epstein's death, the sleeping guards, the malfunctioning cameras, the removal from suicide watch following an ambiguous earlier incident, the disputed forensic findings, constitute a collection of anomalies that, taken together, are difficult to explain as simple institutional failure. Individually, each anomaly has a plausible, mundane explanation. Guards fall asleep. Cameras malfunction. Medical examiners sometimes disagree. These things happen in functioning institutions, let alone in a chronically under-resourced federal detention facility. But all of them, together, on the one night when the man with perhaps the most sensitive information in the federal court system happened to die, that convergence is what has made the suicide ruling so persistently and so widely disbelieved. The people who most needed Epstein to remain silent have, in the years since his death, faced no meaningful trial. No federal prosecution has been brought against any named client or associate. The recordings that allegedly exist have not surfaced. The sealed documents have been released only partially and slowly and with significant redactions intact. That is not a theory. That is a documented outcome. The intelligence connection, perhaps the most significant and most carefully examined of the major Epstein theories, is the one that places him not as an independent criminal operator, but as an asset, a managed, protected, and ultimately disposable instrument of one or more intelligence agencies. The claim, in its most developed form, is this: Jeffrey Epstein's operation was not primarily a personal indulgence. It was not simply the criminal enterprise of an unusually well-connected predator. It was, in whole or insignificant part, an intelligence operation, specifically a honey trap operation of extraordinary sophistication and scope. The honey trap is not a conspiracy theory concept. It is a documented, openly acknowledged tool of intelligence tradecraft, the use of sexual compromise to obtain leverage over individuals of interest. It has been practiced by intelligence services across the world for as long as organized intelligence work has existed. The KGB used it extensively during the Cold War. The CIA has used it. Mossad has used it. It is, in the clinical language of the intelligence world, a collection method, a way of gathering material that can be used to influence the behavior of powerful people without their ever knowing they are being managed. The structural requirements of a successful honey trap operation at the highest levels of global power are significant. You need a credible, attractive social environment, somewhere that powerful people want to be, for reasons that seem entirely legitimate. You need a host who can move comfortably across multiple worlds and make introductions that feel natural. You need infrastructure, properties, transportation, the ability to bring targets to controlled environments. You need surveillance capability, and you need protection, because the operation by its nature involves criminal conduct that would otherwise attract law enforcement attention. When you lay those requirements alongside what Jeffrey Epstein actually had and actually did, the alignment is, at minimum, striking. The most direct piece of documented evidence pointing towards an intelligence connection is Alexander Acosta's statement about being told that Epstein belonged to intelligence and to handle the case accordingly. Acosta served as a United States attorney, a senior federal law enforcement official. The claim that someone above him communicated this instruction is not the statement of a fringe researcher. It is the statement of a man who held a position of significant public trust, and who offered this explanation, however briefly and incompletely, in a public forum. He did not name the agency. He did not name the person who told him. He resigned from his cabinet position without ever elaborating further. No congressional committee called him to testify about it under oath. No Justice Department investigation pursued it. That absence of follow-up is itself a data point. The second major thread in the intelligence theory runs through Robert Maxwell and the world his daughter Ghislaine Maxwell inhabited. Robert Maxwell's connections to Israeli intelligence, specifically to Mossad, are not speculative. They are documented in the work of multiple investigative journalists and biographers, and have been acknowledged by former intelligence officials. Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, in their biography of Maxwell, documented at length his role as a Mossad asset over several decades. Seymour Hersh, one of the most respected investigative journalists in American history, wrote about Maxwell's intelligence connections in the context of the Vanunu affair. The case of an Israeli nuclear technician who attempted to reveal details of Israel's nuclear program and was subsequently abducted. Maxwell reportedly helped facilitate operations that served Israeli intelligence interests on multiple occasions. He used his media properties, his newspapers, his publishing houses, his access to political figures across Europe and America in ways consistent with an ongoing relationship with an intelligence service. He died in 1991. His business empire collapsed almost immediately. His daughter arrived in New York not long after. The question that the intelligence theory raises about Ghislaine Maxwell is not simply whether she was aware of what Epstein was doing. Prosecutors established that she was, and a jury convicted her of it. The question is whether she brought to the operation something more specific, an inherited tradecraft, a set of existing relationships with intelligence services, a continuity of purpose that connected Epstein's network to her father's. Several researchers have argued that this is precisely what happened, that Ghislaine Maxwell was not a passive participant in something Epstein built, but an active architect who brought with her the institutional knowledge and connections her father's world had provided. This cannot be proven from publicly available evidence, but it cannot be disproven either, and it would explain several things that the conventional account of the relationship does not. The third pillar of the intelligence theory involves the surveillance infrastructure that was documented at Epstein's properties. Investigators searching the Manhattan townhouse after his 2019 arrest found surveillance equipment, cameras, recording devices. The presence of this equipment was consistent with what multiple survivors had alleged for years, that Epstein recorded what happened in his properties, that he was deliberate and systematic about it, and that the recordings were maintained somewhere. In intelligence terms, a collection of recordings of that nature, documenting the activities of heads of state, cabinet members, prominent scientists, financiers, and royalty in private and often compromising situations, would represent an asset of extraordinary value, not necessarily for crude blackmail in the sense of direct financial extortion, but for the subtler, more durable form of leverage that intelligence services actually prefer. The unspoken mutual understanding between a handler and a subject, that certain information exists, that it is held somewhere, and that the subject's continued cooperation is connected in ways that never need to be stated explicitly to that information remaining private. This kind of leverage does not require a phone call or a threat. It operates through the simple awareness of what is known. It shapes decisions about investments, about policy, about who gets appointed to which position, about which legal cases are pursued vigorously and which are handled carefully without ever appearing in any record. If Epstein's recordings exist, they have not surfaced publicly. If they were seized by federal investigators, their contents have not been disclosed. If they were removed from his properties before investigators arrived, by whom and to where is unknown. The intelligence theory does not require a single clean answer to these questions. In many of its most carefully reasoned versions, the picture is more complex and more uncomfortable than a simple attribution to one agency or one government. The picture is of a man who found a way to make himself genuinely useful to multiple parties simultaneously, to wealthy patrons like Wexner, to social networks that valued the access and introductions he could provide, and to intelligence interests that recognized the value of what his operation was collecting. A man who received protection from multiple directions because he was, to multiple parties, an asset worth protecting. Until, perhaps, he wasn't. The moment of a second arrest, with new prosecutors in a different jurisdiction, with a stronger evidentiary basis and less appetite for a quiet arrangement, may have represented the point at which the calculation changed. The point at which the protection that had worked for decades was no longer reliable. The point at which, for whoever had the most to lose from a trial, the asset became a liability. What happened next? In a cell in Lower Manhattan, with sleeping guards and malfunctioning cameras, is what it is. Whether it was institutional failure or something more deliberate, that question remains tonight without a public answer. The little black book and the flight logs, among the most concrete pieces of evidence in the Epstein story, concrete in the sense of documented and publicly available, at least in part, are two records that have received enormous and sustained attention. The first is a contact book. It is a physical object, a spiral-bound address book filled with handwritten entries, the kind of personal record that people of Epstein's generation maintained before the digital era made such things obsolete. It contained names, phone numbers, addresses. It was, in the most literal sense, a map of Jeffrey Epstein's world, The people he knew, the people he called, the people who called him. A former Epstein employee named Alfredo Rodriguez obtained a copy of this book and, in 2009, attempted to sell it to lawyers representing Epstein's victims. His intention, by most accounts, was financial. He believed the book's contents were valuable, and he sought to profit from that value. Rodriguez was arrested and convicted of obstruction of justice. The legal finding was not that the book's contents were false or irrelevant, but that his manner of attempting to leverage it violated federal law. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. He died there in 2014 of natural causes before completing his sentence. The book eventually made its way into legal proceedings and ultimately into the public record, at least partially. Gawker Media published what it described as the full contents of the book in 2015, presenting it as a document of extraordinary breadth. The names within it ran to hundreds of entries, political figures from multiple countries, members of European royalty, prominent academics from the most prestigious universities in the United States and Britain, titans of finance and technology, celebrities, artists, socialites, journalists, lawyers. Among the entries that attracted the most attention, telephone numbers listed under the names of multiple members of the British royal family, including direct numbers described as private lines. Multiple contact entries for figures in the highest levels of American political life across multiple administrations. Names from the entertainment industry whose presence in Epstein's contact list prompted years of speculation. And, perhaps most strikingly, several entries that appeared to list contacts within government agencies and intelligence-adjacent organizations. It is important to say again what the book does and does not establish. Having Jeffrey Epstein's phone number, or having your number in Jeffrey Epstein's book, does not constitute evidence of criminal conduct. Epstein was, for much of his active social life, someone who presented himself plausibly as a philanthropist and financier. People collected his number and gave him theirs, for reasons that were, in many cases, entirely innocent. But the book raises a question that its sheer breadth makes unavoidable. How does one person, one private individual with no elected office, no institutional position, no formal role in any government or international organization, come to be in direct personal contact with such an extraordinary range of the most powerful people in the world? The answer the Contact book suggests is not that Epstein was simply popular. It is that he had made himself, deliberately and systematically, into someone that powerful people wanted to know. Someone who could connect them to each other, who could provide things they wanted or needed, who occupied a unique node in a network that very few people could see in its entirety. The second record, the flight logs, tells a similar story, but in motion. The Boeing 727 that Epstein operated was a large aircraft, not a small private jet, but a full commercial-scale plane, capable of carrying dozens of passengers. It had been configured for private use, with sleeping areas and amenities consistent with extended travel. It was, by the accounts of those who flew on it, an extraordinarily comfortable and well-appointed environment. The flight logs from this aircraft and from other planes in Epstein's fleet were subpoenaed during various legal proceedings. They documented, in the dry and factual language of aviation records, who flew where and when. Bill Clinton's name appears in these logs multiple times. The total number of flights Clinton took on Epstein's aircraft has been reported variously. Some sources cite 11 flights, others suggest more. Clinton's representatives have consistently stated that these flights were related to charitable work associated with the Clinton Global Initiative, that Secret Service agents were present on these flights, and that Clinton had no knowledge of Epstein's crimes. The Secret Service presence on some of these flights has been documented. The characterization of their purpose as entirely charitable has been disputed by other passengers and by the flight logs themselves, which show routes that do not always align neatly with the stated charitable activities. Prince Andrew's name appears in the logs, consistent with travel to Epstein's various properties. His presence on these flights became, in the context of the allegations made against him, one of the most discussed elements of the public record. Other names in the logs include individuals who have never been publicly named as suspects in any criminal proceeding, but whose presence, particularly on flights to Little St. James, has been noted by investigators and journalists as potentially significant. Here is the point that the flight logs and the contact book together make, and that the theory built around them crystallizes. The argument is not simply that powerful people knew Jeffrey Epstein. The argument is that the breadth and depth of those connections, across governments, across generations, across the Atlantic, across the divide between public life and private life, could not have been sustained for decades without the knowledge, at least in some circles, of what Epstein was doing. Some of the people in those logs and in that book knew nothing beyond what Epstein chose to show them. That is plausible, and probably true of many of the names. But some, survivors alleged, knew considerably more. Some were alleged participants. Some were alleged to have received directly from Epstein's operation what it was designed to provide. And the theory holds that the reason the non-prosecution agreement was so extraordinarily favorable, the reason the 2008 case was resolved so quietly, the reason the 2019 prosecution was short-circuited by Epstein's death, was not primarily about protecting Jeffrey Epstein. It was about protecting everyone whose name was in the book, everyone whose name was in the logs, everyone whose presence at certain places at certain times, if publicly established under oath at a federal trial, would have changed the landscape of power in ways that the people with the most to lose could not permit. That is the theory at its most essential. Prince Andrew and the royal connection. Of all the named individuals connected to the Epstein story, none has faced more sustained, more public, or more internationally visible scrutiny than Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, the second son of Queen Elizabeth II. The claims against Prince Andrew were made most prominently and most persistently by Virginia Roberts Giuffre, one of the most publicly visible survivors of Epstein's operation. Giuffre's story, as she has told it across multiple legal proceedings and public statements, begins when he was a teenager working at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's private club in Palm Beach, Florida, in the early 2000s. She was approached there by Ghislaine Maxwell, who offered her employment as a personal assistant and masseuse. She was 16 at the time of their first meeting. She was 17 when she alleges the abuse by Prince Andrew began. She described 3 separate encounters with Prince Andrew in specific and consistent detail across years of testimony. The first took place in London, at a house in Belgravia that belonged to Ghislaine Maxwell. The second at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. The third on Little St. James, Epstein's private island in the Virgin Islands. At the center of the public controversy surrounding these allegations is a photograph. The photograph shows a teenage girl, identified as Virginia Giuffre by multiple sources, including Giuffre herself, standing next to a man identified as Prince Andrew, his arm around her waist, both of them appearing relaxed and in good spirits. In the background, partially visible, is a woman identified as Ghislaine Maxwell. The photograph was taken, according to the metadata and contextual evidence associated with it, at Maxwell's London house, consistent with Giuffre's description of the first alleged encounter. Prince Andrew has said he has no recollection of the photograph being taken and questioned its authenticity. Technical analysts commissioned by multiple news organizations examined the image and concluded it showed no signs of manipulation. The photograph has not been officially discredited by any court or forensic body. In November of 2019, Prince Andrew sat down for a live interview with the BBC journalist Emily Maitlis, a conversation that was broadcast in full and that became, almost immediately, one of the most analysed television interviews in recent memory. The interview was notable for several reasons. Prince Andrew denied the core allegations firmly and repeatedly. He said he had no recollection of ever meeting Virginia Giuffre, despite the photographic evidence. He offered as a partial alibi for the night described in the photograph that he had taken his daughter Princess Beatrice to a Pizza Express restaurant in Woking that afternoon, and had then returned to Windsor Castle for a family birthday party, and that he had no memory of being at Maxwell's London house. The Pizza Express alibi became one of the most discussed moments of the interview, not because it was implausible in itself, but because the specificity with which Prince Andrew recalled a routine family outing from approximately 18 years earlier, while professing to have no memory of meeting a young woman in circumstances his accuser described in considerable detail, struck many viewers as inconsistent. He also stated, in response to a question about why he had continued to spend time with Epstein after Epstein's 2008 conviction and release from jail, that he felt it was the honourable thing to do to go in person to inform Epstein that their association had to end. He acknowledged staying at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse for several days during this visit, a decision he described as a mistake in judgment. He described himself as being unable to sweat, a physical condition he cited in response to Giuffre's account of a specific encounter. This claim was contradicted by multiple photographs and accounts from people who had observed him in circumstances inconsistent with anhidrosis. The reaction to the interview was swift and largely unfavourable to Prince Andrew. Several of his charitable patronages ended their associations with him in the days following the broadcast. Businesses and organizations that had been connected to his pitch at Palace Entrepreneurship Initiative withdrew. He stepped back from royal duties, initially described as a temporary arrangement, later made effectively permanent. In August of 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The lawsuit alleged sexual abuse and sought damages. Prince Andrew's legal team mounted several challenges to the lawsuit, including an argument that Giuffre had, in a separate legal settlement with Epstein reached in 2009, agreed to release Epstein and potential unnamed associates from civil liability. This argument was ultimately rejected by the court. In February of 2022, the case was settled out of court. The terms included a financial payment from Prince Andrew to Giuffre, the reported figure, widely cited in British and American press, was in the range of £12 million, though the precise amount was never officially confirmed. Prince Andrew made no admission of liability as part of the settlement. The settlement did not constitute a legal finding of guilt or innocence. He has not returned to public royal duties. The broader questions raised by the Prince Andrew dimension of the Epstein story extend beyond the specifics of what he did or did not do. They ask something larger about the social world that Epstein and Maxwell curated. The British royal family, specifically its more peripheral members, those who occupied a stratum of privilege without the scrutiny that attaches to the direct line of succession, was precisely the kind of institution that Epstein's network was built to access. Title without accountability, social prestige without public visibility, the ability to confer legitimacy on a gathering by being present at it. How Epstein gained that access? Through Maxwell, through shared social circles, through the careful management of his own presentation as a serious philanthropist and intellectual, is documented. What he did with it, in its fullest extent, is not. The island Little St. James is a small island in the United States Virgin Islands. Approximately 75 acres of land, steep and green, rising out of the Caribbean just off the southeastern tip of St. Thomas. Jeffrey Epstein purchased it in 1998 for approximately $7.95 million. It was, at the time of purchase, largely undeveloped. Over the years that followed, he developed it extensively, constructing a main residence, a series of outbuildings, staff quarters, a helipad capable of receiving the helicopters he used for transport from the mainland airports of St. Thomas and St. Croix, and a network of paths and infrastructure that transformed a raw piece of Caribbean real estate into a private compound of considerable scale and comfort. The island had no permanent population beyond Epstein's staff. It had no public access. It existed, in practical terms, entirely outside the normal frameworks of social accountability. No neighbors, no passers-by, no ambient public presence. What happened on Little St. James happened in a space that was, by design, entirely private. Survivors described being brought to the island on multiple occasions. Their testimony in various legal proceedings described abusive conduct occurring there. Conduct that, in their accounts, was more extreme and more organized than what took place at Epstein's mainland properties. The island, in their descriptions, was a place where the ordinary constraints that even a wealthy predator might feel in a city apartment or a Palm Beach mansion were entirely absent. After Epstein's arrest in 2019, federal investigators executed a search warrant on Little St. James. They were photographed arriving at the island. Materials were removed and transported for examination. The specific contents of what was found on Little St. James have never been publicly disclosed in any complete or official accounting. This absence of disclosure is, for many people who have followed the case closely, one of the most striking features of the post-arrest investigation. Search warrants executed on residential properties typically result in the production of evidence that appears in subsequent legal proceedings, and those proceedings, when they result in trial, produce a public evidentiary record. Epstein's death precluded trial. The evidence gathered on the island has therefore not been subjected to the public scrutiny that a trial would have generated. What drew the most sustained public attention to the island in the months and years following Epstein's arrest was a single structure, visible in aerial photographs and satellite imagery taken over several years. The structure stood near the top of one of the island's hills. It was small, roughly the size of a large shed or a small outbuilding. Its exterior featured blue and white striped walls, a color scheme that struck many observers as unusual for a utility structure. It had what appeared, in photographs taken before its modification, to be a gilded or golden dome on its roof. There were what appeared to be doors on its facade. Former workers on the island gave varying descriptions of its function. One described it as a gym. Another described it as a storage facility. A third, in accounts that circulated widely online, suggested it had been used for music, that it had some acoustic quality that made it suitable for listening to or playing music in. None of these descriptions was confirmed in any official proceeding. The structure was modified. The dome was removed or replaced at some point between the earlier aerial photographs and later ones, in what timing suggests may have been a period after legal scrutiny of the island began. The modification drew additional attention to it, on the theory that a structure being altered during an active investigation was of greater rather than lesser interest. Investigators examined the structure. Their findings were not publicly disclosed. The island also attracted attention for evidence in aerial photography and in the accounts of former workers of underground construction. Excavation visible in earlier satellite imagery described areas beneath or adjacent to the main structures that workers characterized as underground rooms or corridors. The existence of underground spaces on the island has been neither officially confirmed nor officially denied in any public record. The accounts of former workers who described such spaces have not been tested in any evidentiary proceeding. What those spaces contained, if they existed, is entirely unknown from any public source. This combination, the undisclosed search warrant results, the modified structure, the unconfirmed underground areas, the testimony of survivors about the island's particular character as a place of abuse, is what transformed Little St. James in the public imagination from a piece of real estate into something that carried a different weight entirely. It became a symbol of the part of the story that has not been told. After Epstein's death, his estate, managed by co-executors who were themselves subjects of legal challenge from survivors seeking compensation, was valued and distributed. Little St. James was listed for sale. It was purchased in 2022 by a private buyer. The new owners subsequently demolished most of the structures that had been built during Epstein's ownership, including, by most accounts, the structure with the blue and white walls. The demolition was legal. The island was private property. The new owners were not connected to Epstein and had no obligation to preserve structures whose historical significance was informal rather than official. But the demolition was noted, and noted widely, by people who had been following the case as the erasure of a physical record that had never been fully read. Whatever took place on Little St. James, in whatever rooms and in whatever configurations of power, over the years that Epstein owned it, the physical evidence of those years no longer exists. What remains is testimony and questions, and the Caribbean water around an island that is now just an island again. Epstein and eugenics. Among the stranger documented facts about Jeffrey Epstein's interests, not theories, but documented statements and reported ambitions, was his stated fascination with genetics, and specifically with human reproduction on a mass scale. Multiple sources who interacted with Epstein in the 2000s reported that he spoke openly and enthusiastically about an idea he had for his Zorro Ranch, his 10,000-acre property in Stanley, New Mexico, a remote and vast expanse of high desert that he had purchased in the 1990s and developed into a compound with a main house, a guest residence, an airstrip, and facilities that made extended stays self-sufficient. The idea, as he described it to scientists and academics who visited him there, was this: he would impregnate a large number of women. The figures he cited varied across different tellings, ranging from dozens to as many as 20 women at a time, with his own sperm, in order to seed the next generation of humanity with his genetic material. This is not a conspiracy theory interpretation of an ambiguous statement. It is not the projection of meaning onto a casual remark. This was reported directly by named sources with academic credentials from conversations that Jeffrey Epstein apparently had without apparent embarrassment or hesitation, at a time when he had already served a prison sentence and his public reputation had been significantly damaged. The New York Times reported on these conversations in the summer of 2019, shortly after Epstein's arrest, drawing on accounts from multiple scientists who had attended Epstein's various gatherings over the years. The scientists who reported these conversations included figures from prominent research institutions, people who had accepted Epstein's invitations to his properties and his dinners, and found themselves presented over dinner with the ideas of a man who appeared to believe that the human species would benefit from a significant infusion of his particular genetic inheritance. Their reactions, as reported, ranged from discomfort to incredulity. Some had already distanced themselves from Epstein by the time they spoke to journalists. Others had continued to accept his hospitality and his donations even after these conversations, a choice that raises its own questions about the culture of scientific philanthropy and the conditions under which institutions accept funding from morally compromised sources. To understand why Epstein's eugenics interest matters, why it is not simply a bizarre personal eccentricity, but something that connects to broader questions about his network. It helps to know something about the intellectual history he was drawing on. Eugenics, as a formal academic discipline, emerged in the late 19th century, associated most prominently with the British scientist Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, who became convinced that the human species could and should be improved through selective reproduction. By encouraging people with desirable traits to have more children, and, in its darker applications, discouraging or preventing those deemed undesirable from reproducing at all. By the early 20th century, eugenics had become a mainstream academic and policy concern. It was taught at major universities. It was endorsed by prominent intellectuals, politicians, and philanthropists across the political spectrum. Eugenics societies existed in the United States, Britain, and across Europe. Forced sterilization laws were passed in multiple American states. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of forced sterilization in 1927 in a decision that has never been formally overturned. The association of eugenics with the Nazi program, which took its theoretical framework from American and British eugenics research and applied it with a brutality that its originators publicly disavowed after the fact, permanently discredited the field in mainstream academic discourse after the Second World War. But it did not disappear. It continued in modified and more carefully worded forms in corners of the scientific establishment that preferred the language of genetics, of human optimization, of population dynamics, and reproductive choice. The ideas were sanitized, rebranded, embedded in new frameworks, but the core interest in managing human reproduction at a population level did not vanish. It went underground, academically speaking, and found its way into the thinking of certain wealthy individuals and the institutions they funded. Epstein's donations to scientific research reflected these interests with considerable specificity. He gave money to Harvard, to MIT, to programs in evolutionary biology and genetics. He funded the work of specific scientists whose research touched on questions of human heredity, cognition, and biological enhancement. He established the Jeffrey Epstein Sixth Foundation, which presented itself publicly as a philanthropic vehicle for scientific education and research. The Foundation's actual agenda, what it was specifically trying to advance, and in whose interests, was never subjected to the kind of public scrutiny that a more transparent institution might have received. Among those who attended Epstein's gatherings were figures from the transhumanist movement, a loosely organized intellectual community united by the belief that technology should be used to transcend the limitations of the human body and the human lifespan. Transhumanist thinkers have argued for the use of genetic engineering to eliminate heritable diseases, for the development of cognitive enhancement technologies, for research into radical life extension, and in their most ambitious formulations, for the eventual merger of human consciousness with artificial intelligence. These ideas exist on a spectrum. From the genuinely progressive, the elimination of genetic diseases is a goal that most people would endorse, to the deeply troubling when they shade into questions about who gets to be enhanced, who decides what enhancement means, and what happens to the people deemed not worth enhancing. Epstein, in the accounts of those who attended his dinners, was drawn to the most grandiose end of this spectrum. He spoke not about eliminating disease, but about improving the species. Not about individual reproductive choice, but about the deliberate redesign of the human population according to a plan. The conspiracy extension of these documented interests takes the following shape. If Epstein's network included some of the most prominent scientists working in genetics, evolutionary biology, and cognitive research, and it did, and if Epstein was using his financial resources and his social infrastructure to connect these scientists to each other and to sources of funding, and the evidence suggests he was, then the question arises, Whether the scientific agenda being advanced through these connections was fully visible to the institutions nominally overseeing it. Harvard and MIT, and the other institutions that accepted Epstein's money and allowed his involvement with their researchers, have, in the years since his arrest, acknowledged that they should have exercised greater scrutiny. Several have donated his gifts to charity or established funds to support survivors. The implicit acknowledgement is that the relationship was not fully examined at the time. What was being built in the spaces between the formal research programs and the dinners at the townhouse and the conferences at the ranch is a question that has not been formally investigated by any official body. The managed network / one thread that runs through nearly all serious analysis of the Epstein case, and that connects the financial mystery, the intelligence theory, the scientific interests, and the social network into a single coherent frame, is the idea that Epstein was, above all else, a builder and manager of a very specific kind of structure. Not simply a wealthy man who committed crimes, not simply an abuser who happened to know powerful people, but an architect, someone who, over the course of approximately 3 decades, deliberately and methodically constructed a network that served purposes more complex and more consequential than any single element of it suggested. The theory pays close attention to the mechanics of how he operated, because the mechanics are unusual enough to warrant attention. Epstein did not simply attend the parties of the powerful and hope to be invited back. He created environments that powerful people wanted to enter, and then made those environments difficult to leave, in ways both social and, according to prosecutors, criminal. The dinners at the Manhattan townhouse are a good example of the social dimension. By multiple accounts, these were not conventional social gatherings. They were intellectually serious, carefully curated events at which the conversation was substantive and the guest lists were extraordinary. Nobel laureates alongside cabinet members, alongside technology entrepreneurs, alongside artists, alongside academics, whose work was at the leading edge of their fields. Attending one of Epstein's dinners meant being in a room with people you would not otherwise meet, having conversations you would not otherwise have. It was, in the language of social capital, an extraordinarily valuable experience. Epstein positioned himself at the center of these experiences, not as a host in the conventional sense, not as a man of established reputation lending his prestige to the gathering, but as a facilitator, a connector, someone whose value was precisely his ability to bring together people who would otherwise not be in the same room, and to do so repeatedly, reliably, with a quality of curation that made the experience genuinely rewarding. This positioning was, in retrospect, a form of structural power. The person who controls access to a network is more powerful in certain ways than any individual member of it, because the members' access to each other runs through the controller. Remove the controller, and the network loses its coherence. This gives the controller leverage over every member that is quiet, ambient, and never needs to be stated directly. He also made himself useful in more concrete ways. He offered financial advice, or the appearance of it, to people who found his mathematical reputation credible. He offered transportation. The availability of a private Boeing 727 is not a trivial thing in the lives of people who travel extensively and value discretion. He offered the island a place entirely outside ordinary social geography where the normal rules of public life did not apply, where whatever happened in a context of complete privacy. These resources were offered with apparent generosity, but generosity in the context of what was actually being built was a mechanism. Every favor extended was a thread in a web. Every resource provided was a data point about the recipient's willingness to accept certain kinds of hospitality, to be in certain kinds of places, to be associated with certain kinds of activities. And underneath all of it According to the evidence gathered by investigators and the testimony of survivors, the cameras were running. The surveillance infrastructure that investigators found at the Manhattan townhouse, and that survivors had alleged for years, was not incidental to Epstein's operation. In the managed network theory, it was the point of it. The social gatherings, the dinners, the travel, the island, all of it was, at least in part, the mechanism by which people of consequence were brought to places where their activities could be documented. The intelligence professionals and analysts who have commented on this structure, some on record in journalism and academic work, others less formally, have consistently noted that it is a model they recognize. The best influence operations don't look like operations. They look like friendships. They look like opportunities. They look like the kind of access that a person of ambition and intelligence naturally seeks. The subject of the operation participates willingly, even enthusiastically, because the surface of what is being offered is entirely genuine. The trap in this model is not a trap in any dramatic sense. It is simply a set of circumstances in which a person has accepted hospitality from someone who was unknown to them, documenting everything, and in which that documentation represents a form of quiet, permanent, unspoken leverage. Who was directing this operation? Whether Epstein was the architect, acting for his own benefit, or an instrument acting on behalf of an intelligence service, or some combination of both, is the question the managed network theory cannot answer from publicly available evidence. But it raises, with considerable force, the observation that the structure Epstein built was too sophisticated, too consistent, and too well-resourced to have been assembled casually. Someone understood what they were building. Whether that someone was Epstein alone, or Epstein and Maxwell, or Epstein and Maxwell and parties who have never been publicly identified, that question is one of the genuinely open ones. The sealed documents. In the years following Epstein's death, the legal proceedings initiated by his survivors produced something that the criminal proceedings never had: a partial, slow, contested, but ultimately real opening of the documentary record. The most significant of these proceedings was the civil lawsuit brought by Virginia Giuffre against Ghislaine Maxwell, a case that predated Maxwell's criminal trial, and that generated, through years of discovery and litigation, an enormous volume of documentary material, depositions, correspondence, declarations, the kind of paper record that civil litigation, with its broad discovery rules, produces in ways that criminal proceedings often do not. For years, this material was sealed. The sealing had been agreed to by both parties at various points in the litigation, and courts had upheld it on grounds relating to privacy and the ongoing nature of related proceedings. The effect was that an enormous body of evidence about the mechanics and membership of Epstein's network sat in court files, unavailable to the public, known to exist, but not readable. The pressure to unseal these documents came from multiple directions: from journalists, from public interest organizations, from survivors who believed that transparency was itself a form of justice. A series of court orders, issued over several years, eventually required the gradual release of portions of this material. In January of 2024, a significant tranche of documents was released. The release generated enormous public and media attention. Anticipation had built for years around the possibility that the full roster of Epstein's network would finally be publicly established. The reality of what was released was, as these things often are, more complex than the anticipation had suggested. The documents were voluminous. They contained detailed testimony about the mechanics of the operation, how recruitment worked, how victims were managed, how the network was maintained. They named individuals who had not previously been publicly named in connection with Epstein. They contained correspondence that illuminated relationships and communications that had not previously been part of the public record. They also contained significant redactions. Names that appeared in some places were blacked out in others. Certain documents that had been referenced in the litigation remained sealed under separate court orders. The picture that emerged was fuller than what had existed before, and still visibly incomplete. Among the names that appeared in the released documents, several attracted immediate attention. Some were people who had been publicly discussed in connection with Epstein for years. Their appearance in the documents added a legal texture to what had previously been journalistic reporting. Others were less expected, individuals whose connection to Epstein had not been widely known, whose names appearing in this context prompted new questions about the scope of the network. It is important to note, again, what appearance in these documents does or does not establish. The documents are civil litigation materials, depositions, correspondence, declarations made in the context of private lawsuits. They are not criminal indictments. They do not constitute findings of guilt. Some of the names that appear do so in the context of testimony about abuse. Others appear in the context of social or professional association. The distinction matters, and in the public reception of the document releases, it was not always carefully maintained. What the sealed documents theory rests on, and what the partial releases have done nothing to diminish, is the persistent, documented reality that a significant body of material relating to the Epstein network remains unavailable to the public. Some of this material is in civil court files, subject to ongoing legal proceedings about its release. Some is in the possession of federal prosecutors, the evidence gathered by the Southern District of New York in connection with Epstein's 2019 indictment, and potentially evidence gathered in connection with Maxwell's prosecution. What prosecutors know, what they have chosen to pursue, and what they have chosen not to, is a question that the public record cannot fully answer. The theory holds that the sealed materials contain what the partial releases have consistently suggested is there, a more complete accounting of who was involved, at what level, in what capacity, over what period of time. An accounting that, if fully public, would change the landscape of public understanding in ways that certain people with access to legal and political resources have consistently worked to prevent. Whether this theory is correct is not publicly verifiable. What is publicly verifiable is that the efforts to prevent full disclosure have been real, sustained, and in several cases successful. Motions to keep documents sealed, appeals of unsealing orders, legal arguments about privacy and relevance, and the rights of named individuals who have not been charged with crimes. These efforts have been made by lawyers paid by people who are named in the documents. That is not a theory. It is the public record of the litigation. And so the sealed documents sit where they sit, some released, some redacted, some still entirely closed, representing the gap between what happened and what is known. Between the full story and the version of it that the people with the most resources have been able to maintain as the official one. That gap has not closed. It may not close for years. It may, in some of its dimensions, never fully close. And the people who know what is in those documents, on all sides of the question, continue, for their own reasons, to say very little. The dead man's switch. A theory that circulated widely after Epstein's death, and that drew on documented reporting about his behavior in the months before his arrest, and on the physical evidence recovered from his properties afterward, involves the idea of what intelligence professionals and legal practitioners call a dead man's switch. The concept is straightforward. A dead man's switch, in its original engineering sense, is a mechanism designed to activate automatically if the person controlling it becomes incapacitated or dies. Applied to the management of sensitive information, it refers to an arrangement by which compromising material, documents, recordings, communications, is held by a trusted party, or stored in a secure location, with instructions to release it under specific conditions. Typically, the condition is the death or arrest of the person who created it. The purpose of such an arrangement for someone in Epstein's position would have been insurance. Not insurance in the financial sense, but insurance in the most literal sense of the word. A guarantee of personal safety maintained through the knowledge by those who might wish to harm him that harming him would trigger consequences they could not control. That Epstein was sophisticated enough to think in these terms is not in question. Whatever else he was a man of considerable strategic intelligence who had, over the course of 3 decades, navigated the most complex and dangerous social environments in the world with remarkable success. He had survived 1 criminal prosecution with minimal consequences. He had maintained relationships with extraordinarily powerful people across multiple decades and multiple jurisdictions. He understood, as well as anyone, the nature of the leverage he possessed and the nature of the threat it represented to others. The documented evidence that points toward some form of prepared contingency begins with what investigators found in his Manhattan townhouse after his July 2019 arrest. Among the items recovered from a safe in the townhouse were quantities of cash. The precise amount was not publicly disclosed, but described by sources familiar with the investigation as significant: diamonds and a passport. Not an American passport, a foreign passport, from a country whose name has been reported variously in different accounts, but which was described as a European nation. The passport bore Jeffrey Epstein's photograph. It did not bear Jeffrey Epstein's name. The existence of a foreign passport in a false name is, in ordinary circumstances, a serious federal crime. It is also, in the context of someone who manages sensitive information and understands the possibility of needing to disappear quickly, a precaution that makes a specific kind of sense. The passport was reportedly issued in the 1980s, decades before his arrest, suggesting that its existence was not a panicked last-minute measure, but a long-standing contingency, maintained across years and presumably renewed or replaced as necessary. What the cash, the diamonds, and the false passport collectively suggest is a picture of a man who had, for a very long time, maintained the practical infrastructure of someone who understood that his situation might, at some point, require either rapid flight or rapid leverage. These are the preparations of someone who understood that his safety was not guaranteed by the goodwill of the people around him, and who had taken steps accordingly. The dead man's switch theory holds that the recordings and documents that Epstein allegedly gathered, the surveillance footage from his properties, the documented evidence of who did what and with whom, were not simply stored on hard drives in his townhouse, where they could be seized and suppressed by the first investigators through the door. They were, in this theory, distributed, held by trusted intermediaries, stored in locations and in forms that could not be neutralized by a single action. The specific mechanics of any such arrangement are, by definition, not publicly known. If the switch exists, it was designed not to be found. If it has been suppressed, the suppression has been effective enough that no evidence of it has surfaced publicly. If it has been activated, if the information it contains has been used quietly to shape decisions or constrain behavior, there is no public record of that either. What the theory rests on is a logical inference from the totality of what is known. A man with Epstein's information, Epstein's intelligence, and Epstein's awareness of the danger he represented to others would, by any rational calculation, have created some form of protection for himself. The question is not whether such a calculation was made. The question is what became of its product, and whether, even now, it is somewhere in the world, held by someone shaping the behavior of people who cannot afford to ignore it. That question has no public answer. And perhaps the most significant thing about the dead man's switch theory is what its existence, real or potential, would mean for the people whose names are in the recordings. If the switch was never created, they are safe from that particular threat. If it was created and has been suppressed, someone suppressed it, and that someone knows what it contains. If it was created and remains active, somewhere in the world there is a set of people who have been living since August of 2019 with the knowledge that certain information about them exists and is held by someone whose interests and intentions they cannot fully predict. That is a particular kind of weight to carry, and it may, in ways that are entirely invisible from the outside, be affecting decisions and behaviors in places of significant power. Robert Maxwell's ghost. The figure of Robert Maxwell, media tycoon, member of the British Parliament, alleged intelligence asset, father of Ghislaine, casts a shadow over the Epstein story that grows longer rather than shorter, the more carefully you examine it. Ian Robert Maxwell was born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch in 1923 in a small village in what was then Czechoslovakia into a poor Jewish family in a region that would, within 2 decades, be consumed by the machinery of the Holocaust. He survived. He made his way to Britain during the Second World War, served with distinction in the British Army, and emerged from the war as a decorated officer with a new name, a new nationality, and an extraordinary capacity for reinvention. He built a business empire that, at its peak, was one of the largest private media operations in the world. He owned the Daily Mirror, one of Britain's most widely read newspapers. He owned Macmillan Publishers, one of the most prestigious publishing houses in the English-speaking world. He owned the New York Daily News. He sat in the British Parliament as a Labour member. He was, by any external measure, one of the most powerful private individuals in Britain for the better part of 3 decades. He was also, according to multiple documented sources, a long-term asset of Israeli intelligence. The evidence for this is not speculative. Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, in their biography of Maxwell, published in 2002, documented his relationship with Mossad in considerable detail, drawing on sources within the intelligence community. The investigative journalist Seymour Hersh wrote about Maxwell's intelligence connections in the context of his book on Israel's nuclear weapons program. Nicholas Davies, a journalist who worked for Maxwell's Mirror Group and later wrote about his experiences, described Maxwell as a man with deep and ongoing relationships with multiple intelligence services, including not only Mossad, but elements of Soviet and Eastern European intelligence during the Cold War period. Maxwell's specific alleged contributions to Israeli intelligence included the facilitation of technology transfers, the movement of sensitive technological knowledge from Western sources to Israel, through the cover of legitimate publishing and business operations. He reportedly helped arrange introductions between Israeli intelligence officials and individuals in Western governments and institutions. He used his media properties in ways that his biographers suggest served intelligence objectives that were not visible in the newspaper's public content. He died in November of 1991. The manner of his death, found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, having apparently gone overboard during the night, was ruled accidental by Spanish authorities. British inquest proceedings were less conclusive. Several investigators and biographers have argued that the evidence is more consistent with homicide, that Maxwell, who was at the time under serious financial and legal pressure as the scale of his fraudulent business practices began to emerge, had also become a liability to some of the intelligence services he had worked with, and that his death was arranged accordingly. Whether Robert Maxwell was murdered is not publicly resolved. What is publicly established is that his death removed from a position of significant power and knowledge a man who knew a great deal about the operations of multiple intelligence services, and that his death came at a moment of maximum legal and financial vulnerability, when the prospect of his testifying or cooperating with investigators would have been most threatening to those interests. The parallel to Epstein's death is one that researchers have noted repeatedly, and not without reason. When Ghislaine Maxwell arrived in New York in the years after her father's death, stripped of the wealth and social position she had grown up with, navigating the wreckage of his legacy, she brought with her something that cannot be precisely inventoried, but that the totality of her subsequent behavior suggests was real and significant. She brought knowledge of how influence operations work, knowledge of how powerful people are cultivated, managed, and, when necessary, handled. Knowledge of the specific architecture of international intelligence relationships that her father had inhabited for decades. And, most concretely, connections, relationships maintained across her father's networks that survived his death, and that she could, if she chose, activate. The theory that Ghislaine Maxwell was not simply a participant in something Epstein built, but was, in a meaningful sense, the operational intelligence at its center, rests on an observation about capability and knowledge. Jeffrey Epstein was, by most accounts, extraordinarily intelligent, but intelligence alone does not build a network of the sophistication and reach that the Epstein operation represented. That kind of network requires tradecraft, the specific, practiced knowledge of how to recruit, how to compromise, how to maintain leverage, how to protect an operation from scrutiny. Tradecraft is learned. It is passed down. It lives in relationships and in knowledge transmitted from one generation to the next, through the kind of proximity that Ghislaine Maxwell had to her father's world for the entirety of her formative years. Whether she maintained, after his death, an active relationship with the intelligence services he had served, whether the Epstein operation was, in some operational sense, an extension of a program that had its roots in Robert Maxwell's work, is a question that no public investigation has formally examined. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in December of 2021 on 5 counts related to sex trafficking and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Her legal team indicated that she had expressed willingness to cooperate with investigators. The nature and extent of any cooperation she provided, and what she may have communicated about the broader dimensions of the operation she was part of, is not publicly known. Robert Maxwell's ghost in the Epstein story is the ghost of a question that was never formally asked, about the deeper architecture of what was built, and who built it, and what purpose it ultimately served. The broader elite ecosystem. Perhaps the deepest and most unsettling theory connected to the Epstein case is not really a theory about Jeffrey Epstein at all. It is a theory about the world he came from, the world he served, the world that protected him for as long as it could, and has, since his death, returned to its ordinary operations with a remarkable absence of visible disruption. The claim, advanced in various forms by survivors, investigative journalists, academic researchers, and former law enforcement officials, is this: Jeffrey Epstein was not an aberration. He was not a uniquely monstrous individual who somehow, through extraordinary cunning, infiltrated a world of otherwise law-abiding and ethically intact powerful people. He was instead particularly visible and particularly well-documented expression of something that has always been present at varying levels of organization within the structures of concentrated power. The sexual exploitation of young and vulnerable people by individuals of wealth and influence is not, in this theory, a series of isolated incidents. It is a pattern, and the consistent institutional response to that pattern, when it surfaces, when it becomes impossible to ignore, is not accountability, it is containment. The evidence cited in support of this claim extends well beyond Epstein and draws on a documented historical record that is, when assembled in a single frame, difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Jimmy Savile was a British television personality, a BBC presenter, a charity fundraiser, a Knight of the Realm, who was, in his lifetime, one of the most publicly visible and apparently beloved figures in British popular culture. After his death in 2011, investigations revealed that he had sexually abused an estimated 450 people over the course of several decades, with victims ranging from children to elderly hospital patients. The abuse had occurred in BBC studios, in hospitals, in charitable institutions. Colleagues had known or suspected for years. Institutions had been informed and had chosen not to act. The BBC conducted an internal review that concluded, with considerable institutional discomfort, that his behaviour had been known to a significant number of people and had been consistently ignored or suppressed. The Penn State case in the United States followed a similar pattern. Jerry Sandusky, an assistant football coach at one of the country's most prominent universities, was convicted in 2012 of 45 counts of child sexual abuse committed over a period of 15 years. The investigation that preceded his conviction established that multiple senior officials at the university, including its legendary head football coach and its president, had been informed of Sandusky's conduct and had chosen to protect the institution rather than the victims. The Catholic Church abuse scandal, documented across dozens of countries, involving thousands of perpetrators and tens of thousands of victims, spanning generations, established with exhaustive, painful clarity that one of the world's most powerful institutions had, for decades and in many cases, for centuries, maintained a systematic policy of protecting its members from accountability at the direct expense of the children in its care. These cases are not connected to each other through any network. They are connected through a structure, the structure of how powerful institutions respond when one of their members is revealed to be an abuser. The response is consistent. Dismiss the initial reports, delay the investigation, transfer the perpetrator to a new environment where his history is unknown. Negotiate quietly with victims or their families, often with confidentiality agreements attached to any financial settlement. Maintain the institutional reputation above all other considerations. And when concealment becomes impossible, express institutional sorrow while ensuring that accountability falls as narrowly as possible, on the individual rather than on the structure that enabled and protected him. The Epstein case fits this pattern with uncomfortable precision and exceeds it in several dimensions. The 2008 non-prosecution agreement represents, in this reading, not a unique failure, but the standard operating procedure of institutions protecting their own, applied at an unusually high level of power. The agreement protected not just Epstein, but through its immunity provisions, unnamed co-conspirators. It was negotiated in secret. It was designed to minimize disruption to the social ecosystem that Epstein inhabited. The same ecosystem that included the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the judges, and the political figures whose relationships with each other extended far beyond any single legal case. What the broader elite ecosystem theory asks is a question that the individual case cannot answer. If this is what happened when Jeffrey Epstein was finally prosecuted, if this is the most accountability that the system was willing to produce for a man whose crimes were as extensively documented as his, what does that tell us about the system itself? The answer the theory offers is not comforting. It suggests that the protection Epstein received was not exceptional. It was normal. It was what the system does reliably and consistently when one of its own is threatened with accountability. The exceptional thing about the Epstein case is not the protection. It is the degree to which the protection became visible, the degree to which the machinery of containment was exposed. Through aggressive investigative journalism and the persistent courage of survivors, to a level of public scrutiny that the people operating it had not anticipated and could not fully control. And even then, even with that exposure, the accountability produced was limited. One prosecution ended by a death, one conviction of the operational partner, a civil settlement system through which some survivors received financial compensation under confidentiality agreements, a collection of partially unsealed documents, and a continuing silence from the vast majority of the people whose names appear in the records. The survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's operation have said, many of them, that what they want most is not a financial settlement. It is not even, primarily, the incarceration of specific individuals. It is acknowledgement, the formal, public, institutional acknowledgement that what happened to them happened, that it was enabled by a structure of complicity that extended far beyond a single man and a single woman, and that the world which enabled it has not, in any meaningful sense, changed. That acknowledgement has not been provided by any official body, and the broader elite ecosystem, the dinners and the connections and the quiet arrangements between powerful people, continues to function as it always has just outside the light. Of course, not everyone interprets the Epstein story through the lens of conspiracy, and it is worth spending some time with the skeptical and mainstream positions, not to dismiss the serious questions the case raises, not to suggest that the official story is satisfying or complete, but because some of the counter-arguments are genuinely important. And because the Epstein story has, in certain corners of the internet and certain political spaces, been extended into claims that go well beyond what the evidence supports, in ways that have paradoxically made it harder rather than easier to understand what actually happened. The most fundamental counterpoint is about the distinction between documented fact and speculation. And it is a distinction worth drawing carefully, because in the Epstein case, the documented facts are already so extraordinary that they require no embellishment. A wealthy and well-connected man ran a sex trafficking operation for decades. He victimized a large number of young women and girls, some as young as 14. He received, in 2008, a federal non-prosecution agreement that legal scholars across the political spectrum have described as one of the most inappropriate and legally anomalous agreements in the recent history of federal prosecution. One that protected him from the charges he should have faced, that shielded unnamed co-conspirators from investigation. And that was negotiated in secret from the victims whose rights it violated. He was rearrested in 2019. He died in federal custody under circumstances that remain genuinely disputed. His primary associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, was convicted in 2021 of sex trafficking conspiracy and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. These facts, standing alone, are serious enough to warrant the attention they have received. They represent documented criminal conduct of significant scale and documented institutional failure of significant depth. No conspiracy theory is required to find them disturbing. The question the skeptics raise, and it is a legitimate question, is at what point the documented facts end and the theory begins. Because in the public discourse around Epstein, that line has sometimes been drawn carelessly, in ways that have consequences for how clearly any of this can be thought about. Omni-intelligence claims the claim that Epstein was an asset of the CIA, or of Mossad, or of some combination of intelligence services, has circumstantial support, some of it genuinely suggestive, but has not been confirmed by any official investigation, any declassified document, or any named former intelligence official speaking on the record. Acosta's reported statement that he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence is the most significant data point in this direction. It is significant precisely because of who said it and in what context. Acosta was a senior federal law enforcement official. His statement, if accurate, implies that someone in a position of authority communicated something to a sitting United States attorney that affected the outcome of a federal criminal case. But it is worth noting what the statement actually is. A second-hand account, reported by journalists drawing on sources familiar with conversations that took place in private. Acosta himself offered this explanation in a press conference in 2019 in the context of defending his handling of the case, and did not elaborate further. He has not testified under oath about it. He has not named the person who communicated this to him. He died in 2023 without having provided any further public account. The absence of official confirmation does not mean the claim is false. Intelligence relationships are, by their nature, designed to leave no confirmable public record. The argument that the lack of confirmation is itself evidence of how carefully the secret was kept is not irrational. But it also means that the intelligence claim cannot be treated as established fact, because the evidentiary standard for established fact requires more than suggestive circumstances. What can be said with more confidence is that someone, some person or persons, in a position of authority over a sitting United States attorney, communicated something that caused that attorney to handle a serious federal criminal case in a way that was grossly favorable to the defendant. What the nature of that communication was, who made it, and on whose behalf remains publicly unresolved. That is disturbing enough without requiring the full architecture of the intelligence theory to be accepted as proven. On the death, the claim that Epstein was murdered rather than having died by suicide rests on a set of genuinely anomalous circumstances. The sleeping guards, the malfunctioning cameras, the disputed forensic findings that are difficult to explain away entirely. But the skeptical position makes a point worth sitting with. The Metropolitan Correctional Center, at the time of Epstein's death, was a facility in serious institutional distress. It was chronically understaffed. Guards were routinely working double shifts, or extended overtime, that exceeded Bureau of Prisons guidelines. Equipment was aging and poorly maintained. The culture of the facility, by the accounts of people familiar with it, was one of exhaustion and minimal compliance rather than rigorous professionalism. In that context, guards falling asleep during overnight shifts is not extraordinary. It is, by multiple accounts, something that happened regularly. Cameras malfunctioning in an aging, poorly maintained facility is not extraordinary. These things happen in institutions that are not given the resources to function properly. The convergence of these failures on the specific night of Epstein's death is, as we have discussed, striking. But convergences of failures are not always engineered. Sometimes they are simply what happens when a system is stressed enough for long enough. The forensic disagreement between Dr. Baden and the official medical examiner is real. Dr. Baden is a credentialed and experienced professional whose conclusions deserve serious consideration. But so is Dr. Sampson. Two experienced forensic pathologists can examine the same body and reach different conclusions about the manner of death. This happens in cases that attract no particular conspiratorial attention. The disagreement is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence of genuine scientific uncertainty in a field where such uncertainty is not uncommon. What the skeptical position asks is that the uncertainty be acknowledged as uncertainty rather than resolved by the force of narrative. The death may have been a murder, it may have been a suicide. The evidence, as publicly available, does not definitively establish either. Treating the murder theory as proven, as many commentators have done, is an overstatement of what the record shows. What can be said is that the circumstances were anomalous, that the anomalies have never been satisfactorily explained by any official investigation, and that the outcome, Epstein's death before trial, served the interests of a significant number of powerful people. Whether that outcome was engineered or was the product of institutional failure compounded by bad fortune is a question the public record cannot answer. On the names in the documents, the flight logs and the contact book are real documents. The names in them are real names. But the extension from presence in a document to criminal liability is a leap that the evidence does not always support, and that has been made in certain online spaces with a recklessness that has caused real harm to people who were named. Many of the individuals whose names appear in Epstein's contact book or in his flight logs had relationships with him that were, in the earlier years of those relationships, entirely plausible as legitimate. Epstein presented himself convincingly as a scientific philanthropist, a financial genius, an intellectual with an unusual ability to bring interesting people together. He cultivated his reputation carefully. People who accepted his invitations to dinner or flew on his plane to attend a conference or had his number in their phone were not necessarily doing anything other than what the surface of the situation suggested. The question of what was known and when is genuinely complex. For some named individuals, the evidence suggests that they had information about the nature of Epstein's operation at an early stage and continued their association regardless. For others, the evidence suggests they were largely unaware. For a third group, the evidence is ambiguous in ways that have not been resolved by any legal or investigative process, treating all named individuals as equivalent, as if appearing in the flight logs or the contact book established the same level of culpability for everyone, is an error. It is an error that has been exploited at various points by political actors seeking to damage opponents by association. And it has made it harder, not easier, to identify who actually bears meaningful responsibility for what happened. The flight logs document presence on an aircraft. They document that someone was in a particular place at a particular time. They do not, by themselves, document what that person knew, what they did, or what their relationship to Epstein's criminal operation actually was. Those are separate questions requiring separate evidence. Evidence that, in most cases, has not been gathered by any official proceeding. On the appropriation of the story. The Epstein case has been used by actors on multiple sides of the political spectrum, in ways that have more to do with existing political agendas than with the actual facts of what happened. On one side, the case has been used to attack political figures whose names appear in documents, with the emphasis placed selectively on names associated with one political party, while names associated with the other are minimized or ignored. The flight logs have been cited extensively in connection with certain individuals and barely mentioned in connection with others, depending entirely on the political convenience of the citation. On another side, the case has been incorporated wholesale into the QAnon framework, a sprawling conspiracy narrative that grafted the documented reality of Epstein's crimes onto a much larger, largely unsupported set of claims about global networks of satanic ritual abuse, involving a cast of named individuals for whom no credible evidence of involvement in abuse has ever been produced. The QAnon appropriation of the Epstein case did significant damage to the ability of the public to think clearly about it, by embedding the documented facts inside a framework of claims that were demonstrably false or wildly speculative. It created a situation in which engaging seriously with the real questions the Epstein case raises required first navigating a landscape of misinformation that made serious engagement more difficult. It also, not coincidentally, provided people with an interest in minimizing serious scrutiny of the Epstein case with a ready tool for doing so, because dismissing QAnon as nonsense is easy, and the conflation of QAnon with all Epstein-related inquiry made it possible to dismiss the real questions along with the invented ones. These uses of the case, for partisan political advantage, for the amplification of pre-existing conspiratorial frameworks, are worth naming clearly. They are not what the survivors of Epstein's operation asked for. They are not what careful investigators and journalists have spent years working toward. They are the appropriation of a story of real harm for purposes that have nothing to do with accountability or justice. What the skeptical position does not resolve. Having walked through the counter-arguments, and they are real counter-arguments, deserving serious consideration, it is important to be equally honest about what the skeptical position does not resolve. It does not explain the non-prosecution agreement. The argument that the 2008 deal was the product of prosecutorial judgment, institutional risk aversion, and the formidable legal team Epstein assembled may be partially true. But it does not explain the specific provisions that went beyond any reasonable prosecutorial calculation. The immunity for unnamed co-conspirators, the sealing of the agreement from victims, the work release arrangement that no standard application of Bureau of Prisons guidelines would have permitted. Those provisions required decisions. Those decisions were made by specific people. Those people have not been held accountable, and the reasons for those specific decisions have never been publicly established. It does not explain the financial mystery. The argument that Epstein may have had legitimate financial management clients who simply preferred privacy, or that his wealth derived from Wexner in ways that have been obscured by both parties, is plausible as far as it goes. But no official investigation has produced a documented, verified account of where Jeffrey Epstein's money actually came from. That absence, across multiple federal investigations spanning multiple decades, is not explained by the skeptical position. It is simply noted and set aside. It does not explain the continued sealing of materials. The legal arguments for maintaining certain documents under seal are real. Privacy interests, ongoing investigations, the rights of individuals who have not been charged. But the pattern of resistance to disclosure across multiple proceedings and multiple years reflects the sustained exercise of legal resources by people with strong interests in preventing certain information from becoming public. That pattern is documented. Its explanation is not adequately provided by standard legal process. And it does not explain the survivors. The women who testified in depositions, in criminal trials, in civil proceedings, in public statements made at enormous personal cost over many years, described what happened to them in consistent, specific, and documented detail. They named names, they described places and times and circumstances that have been corroborated, where corroboration was possible, by documentary evidence, their accounts of what occurred, and of who was present and of what the people present knew and did. These accounts exist in the record. The skeptical position does not dispute that these women were abused. It does not dispute that Epstein and Maxwell are guilty. What it disputes is the broader architecture, the intelligence connections, the murder theory, the fully coordinated cover-up. But even the most conservative, most skeptical reading of the evidence requires acknowledging that the survivors described a network, not a single perpetrator, and that the network they described has not been fully investigated, has not been held accountable, and has not, in any meaningful public sense, been named. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a gap in the record, and the people who could close that gap have consistently and collectively chosen not to. Tonight we covered a great deal of ground. We began in Brooklyn, in the 1950s, with a boy from a working-class family and a restless, mathematical mind. A boy who had no inheritance except his own intelligence, and who would spend the rest of his life turning that intelligence toward the acquisition of something he was never fully able to name or satisfy. We followed him through the corridors of finance, through the classrooms of a prestigious school where the children of the powerful sat in rows and a young teacher with no credentials made his first significant impressions on the people who mattered, through the trading floors of Bear Stearns and into the strange opaque world of a financial management firm that managed apparently almost nothing, and yet somehow generated a fortune large enough to sustain an empire of properties and aircraft and influence that spanned continents and decades. We sat with the documented crimes, the young women and girls who were recruited, who who were brought to places they had not chosen, who were harmed in ways that left marks that no legal settlement can fully address. We sat with their testimony, careful, specific, consistent, across years and across multiple legal proceedings, and we acknowledged that what they described was real, and that it happened for as long as it did, because the world around it chose, repeatedly and at every level of available intervention, not to stop it. We moved through the first prosecution and its extraordinary resolution, the sealed agreement, the work release, the immunity for unnamed others, the sentence that bore no relationship to the conduct it was meant to address. We sat with Acosta's explanation and the intelligence claim embedded in it, and the silence that has surrounded that claim in every official forum since it was made. We travelled through the theories, through the intelligence connections and the Maxwell family history and the surveillance equipment and the recordings that may or may not still exist somewhere in the world. Through the island, its structures now demolished, its secrets unspoken. The Caribbean water around it indifferent to everything that may have happened on its shores. Through the sealed documents and the dead man switch, and the broader ecosystem that made all of it possible and has never been held to account for doing so. We listened to the skeptics, who made real points about the difference between what is known and what is suspected, between documented fact and the interpretations we place upon it, between the convergence of institutional failures and the deliberate engineering of outcomes. Their points are worth holding alongside everything else, not as a reason to stop asking questions, but as a reason to ask them carefully. And we ended as honest inquiry tends to end not with resolution, but with the shape of what is missing. The money that was never traced. The recordings that were never publicly accounted for. The intelligence claim that was never officially investigated. The cooperation that was offered and apparently not acted upon. The question of how many people knew and knew enough and chose the comfort of not knowing more. There are survivors of what Jeffrey Epstein did who have spent the better part of their adult lives carrying the weight of what happened to them in their teens. Who told their stories in rooms where lawyers asked them detailed and painful questions? Who told their stories again in depositions? Who told their stories in criminal trials and in civil proceedings and in public statements and in books and in interviews and in whatever forms of telling were available to them? Who were for many years not believed, or believed but not considered important enough to disturb the arrangements of more powerful people? Some of them have received financial settlements. Some have received the formal legal recognition of a criminal conviction. None of them have received the full accounting they asked for, the accounting that would name every person involved at every level of involvement and assign to each of them a consequence proportionate to what they did or enabled or ignored. That accounting has not come. It may not come in the near future. It may not come in our lifetimes. And yet, the asking of it matters. The record of the asking matters. The fact that a story this deeply protected, this surrounded by resources and by silence, has been told as fully as it has, through the work of journalists who spent years on it, through the courage of survivors who told the truth when telling it cost them something, through the legal persistence of attorneys who kept cases alive when every institutional force was pointed toward their closure. That fact matters. The theories exist because the official story has gaps. The gaps exist because powerful people benefit from their existence. That is, at its simplest, what this story is about. Whether the recordings still exist somewhere, whether the sealed documents contain what careful researchers believe they contain, whether the full architecture of what was built is someday made visible in the way that it deserves to be. We don't know tonight. We may not know for years. Some of it, very possibly, will never surface in any form that can be called official or final. But the questions will continue to be asked by journalists, by lawyers, by the survivors themselves, who have demonstrated over and over, a tenacity that the people who wronged them consistently underestimated by ordinary people who read and listen and refuse to accept the comfortable conclusion that the official story is complete. Tonight, we have done our part of that asking. It is enough for now. The story will still be there in the morning unfinished, as it has always been, waiting for the next person willing to follow the next thread into the next room of it. But that is for another day. For now, let the questions rest where they are. Let the weight of them settle. Let the mind that has been holding all of this slowly, gently release it into the dark. You've carried it carefully tonight. That's enough.